The Burrow did not so much wake up in the mornings as erupt. Molly Weasley had developed an immunity to most of it over the years. The sound of two 7-year-olds using each other as projectile objects was simply background noise by now, a constant she had learned to filter, the way one eventually stopped hearing the ghoul shifting around in the attic. What she could not filter was the chess. Ron had been playing himself again, the black pieces against the white, in what appeared to be an extremely personal grudge match, and he had taken to narrating every move in a carrying voice that penetrated 2 closed doors and the cat. "Take the knight," he was advising his own queen as Molly came downstairs. "Now, I would." "You are the queen," Percy said, without looking up from his book. He was in the far armchair with the resigned expression of a 9-year-old who had long since run out of ways to convey this point. "I know that." "Then why are you talking about yourself in the third person?" "Because she's got more confidence than I do," Ron said, entirely seriously, and moved the piece. The queen took the knight. The knight complained loudly. Ginny, sitting in the middle of the kitchen floor with a wooden spoon and a perfectly contented expression, watched all of this with the untroubled calm of someone who had been watching older brothers be ridiculous since before she could walk. She waved the spoon at Molly when she appeared, and Molly stepped over her automatically, the way she stepped over every obstacle the morning presented. Gnome tracks in the linoleum, Percy's books, the cat. "Where's your father?" she asked. "Already gone," Fred said, appearing from nowhere with a garden gnome under one arm. The gnome was biting his elbow. Fred had not appeared to notice. "Said he had a trace." "Underage magic," George supplied, materializing beside his twin as he always did, as though they operated on some shared instinct that preceded language entirely. He had a gnome of his own, tucked under his other arm like a furious small parcel. Muggle Surrey somewhere. Molly turned from the stove. She did not know, not yet, why that word should settle against her ribs the way it did. Surrey. Like a stone dropped into still water. She looked toward the door, half expecting Arthur to walk back through it by willing it hard enough. But there was only the sound of gnomes in the garden, and, above, the muffled, rhythmic thump of the attic ghoul making its morning progress through the eaves. "He said he'd be back by lunch," Fred offered helpfully. Something sat at the base of Molly's throat that she could not quite name. She filed it away, the way you filed things that had not yet become a problem, and poured the tea. In Little Whinging, Surrey, on a street so orderly it appeared to have been pressed flat and then starched, Arthur Weasley stood at the end of a front path that had been weeded to a standard suggesting personal grievance, and tried to remember the last time a routine trace call had made him feel this uneasy before he had even knocked. A minor flare of accidental magic, the kind that tended to be small children in the middle of bad dreams, suppressed and leaking sideways into the physical world. He had driven here in a ministry vehicle, nothing enchanted, parked at the curb, and walked up to the door. It was opened by a woman who went the color of old chalk the moment she saw his robes. Not surprised, not curious, afraid. He noticed that. He kept his expression professionally pleasant. "I'm from the ministry," he said. "I've had a trace alert, a small magical incident at this address overnight. I just need to verify that everyone is all right." The woman was thin and long-necked, with the rigid posture of someone who had been bracing against something constant and invisible for a very long time. She said nothing. A large man appeared at the end of the hall and looked at Arthur, the way people looked at a problem they hoped would stop existing if ignored firmly enough. "There's been a mistake," Harry's uncle said. "We don't have anything like that here." "I understand," Arthur said pleasantly. It should only take a moment. He was not entirely certain, even later, how the next few minutes unfolded. He remembered the woman's eyes going, involuntarily, to the small door beneath the stairs. He remembered following that glance without meaning to. He remembered the latch being cold under his hand. He opened the door. From behind him, Petunia said, in a carefully level voice, "He's perfectly fine. He's only in there because of his nightmares. He disturbs the whole house otherwise." Arthur did not answer her. He crouched down in front of the door and looked at the boy inside. The boy was 6 years old. He was small and thin, with dark, untidy hair, and when he blinked up at Arthur from a space that contained a thin blanket, a broken toy car, and nothing else, his eyes were the color of new leaves, the very specific green that Arthur had seen exactly once before, in a photograph at a memorial service 5 years ago, standing in a room full of people who had loved a woman who was gone. Lily Potter's eyes. On Lily Potter's son. The lightning bolt scar curved across his forehead, precise and unmistakable in the dim light from the hallway. Arthur stood up very slowly. He turned to look at Harry's uncle, and he was aware, from some distant part of himself, that his expression had changed in a way he was no longer entirely in control of. He was a mild-mannered man, most days. He believed in procedure and paperwork, and the measured application of ministry guidelines to ministry situations. "How long?" he said, very quietly. "Has he been sleeping in there?" No one answered. He crouched back down. Harry was looking at him with the careful, measuring attention of a child who had learned to read adults very carefully and very young, scanning for the tell that meant the kindness was temporary, the warning sign that came before things got worse. "Hello," Arthur said. "My name is Arthur. I'd like to take you somewhere better, if you're willing." Harry considered this for a moment. He appeared to be weighing something with great seriousness, the sincerity of the offer against the accumulated weight of experience. Then he said, "Okay," in a voice that was very small and entirely without performance. It was the most heartbreaking word Arthur Weasley had ever heard. He sent his owl from a post box 3 streets over, with a note to Molly that was deliberately brief. He was bringing someone with him. She should not worry. He would explain everything when he got home. She would absolutely worry. He watched the owl disappear in a straight, unhesitating line toward Devon, and felt the full weight of the day settle properly around him. They drove back through a gilded late afternoon, the light falling through motorway trees in long, slanted columns. Harry sat very straight in the passenger seat, with his hands on his knees, and said nothing for a long time, watching the road with careful, undivided attention, as though he was afraid it might change direction if he stopped looking. Once or twice he touched his scar, lightly, the reflexive way you'd check a bruise. Arthur kept his eyes on the road. He did not ask the questions pressing at the back of his throat, because he already knew most of the answers, and the rest he suspected he would not like. He drove past Bristol, past the long, glittering edge of the estuary, past the first signs for Devon. Somewhere outside Exeter, Harry fell asleep against the window with his mouth slightly open and the scar pale against his forehead in the fading light. Arthur glanced over at it once. Then he looked firmly back at the road. He thought about what he would say to Molly, and how to say it. He thought about the house, held together by stubbornness and strategic enchantments and not much else, and 7 children, and the ghoul, and all the 1,000 small calculations of a family that was already stretched thin. He thought about Dumbledore, who had presumably had reasons Arthur had not been given to understand, and which he suspected were considerably more complicated than the inside of a cupboard under a staircase suggested they ought to be. He thought about a small, dark-haired boy saying "okay" in a voice that had expected nothing and decided to try anyway. The road ran south, the sky went orange, then deep blue, then something quieter than either. Harry slept on beside him, and the scar was still on his forehead, and the Burrow was an hour away. Arthur Weasley didn't know, not fully, what he had done today. He knew only that he had found a child where no child should be kept, and that he had not been able to leave him there, and that he would make the same choice again tomorrow without hesitation. That seemed, for the moment, like enough to know. The first thing Harry Potter noticed about his room at the Burrow was that it had a window. The second thing he noticed, lying very still in the dark, the way he had trained himself to lie still in the dark, was that no one was going to come in. The house made sounds, the ghoul shifting overhead in its slow, particular way, the creak of timber settling, the low complaints of a structure held together by magic and stubbornness in roughly equal measure. He lay listening to all of it for a long time. Eventually, he decided that none of it was going to hurt him. The bed was still there. The window was still there. No one had come in. He sat up. Ron's room was in the sort of organized chaos that only made sense to the person who had organized it. Half the surfaces belonged to a chess set in various states of mid-game. The other half were covered in things Harry did not know the names for yet. Quidditch pennants, strange shining objects on strings, books in precariously tall towers. The room smelled like old parchment. Through the window in the early grey light, Harry could see the Burrow's garden, sprawling and overgrown, the hedge at its far edge, grass gone long and complicated at the borders. Something moved near the hedge, something potato-shaped with too much head. From below, a smell arrived. Deliberate cooking, by someone who knew what they were doing, applied to quantities of food that assumed several people intended to eat. Harry followed it downstairs. Ron was already at the table, eating toast and reading the back of a chess book with the focused expression of someone prepared to ignore everything else in his immediate environment. He looked up when Harry came in. "Morning," he said, with the easy lack of ceremony of someone to whom other people's presence was unremarkable. He pushed the toast rack toward Harry without looking away from his book. They ate in companionable silence for several minutes. Harry ate more carefully than he had the first morning. Yesterday he had eaten so fast he had felt ill, and Molly had put a hand on his shoulder and said nothing and refilled his pumpkin juice, and he had understood from this that the food was not going anywhere, and he was not required to prove anything about deserving it. He was working on believing this. He ate the toast in small pieces and believed it a little more with each one. "Do you play chess?" Ron asked eventually. Harry said he didn't. "I'll teach you," Ron said, with the simple confidence of someone who had not considered that this might not be a welcome offer. "I've been teaching Ginny, but she just knocks the pieces over. She says it's more fun. She's wrong." He turned a page. "I beat Percy last Tuesday. He said it was luck. It wasn't." Ron had not asked. He did not appear to be about to. "You don't have to not ask about the scar," Harry said, because the not asking was almost more disconcerting than the asking would have been. "I know," Ron said. "Mum explained. You're staying here, and we should treat you the same as anyone." He shrugged. "So I am." He put down the chess book. "Come and see the set. It actually argues back. George's set just sulks, but mine properly argues." He met Scabbers after breakfast. Ron produced the rat from his shirt pocket with the offhand pride of long ownership. Scabbers was grey and somewhat elderly-looking, missing a toe on his front paw, and when Ron held him up with casual affection, he fixed his small black eyes directly on Harry's forehead. Harry's scar prickled. He knew this feeling. He had felt it at the Dursleys sometimes, in the night. a cold, distant pressure behind his forehead, like something very large and very far away, becoming briefly aware that he existed. He had never been able to explain it, and had learned not to try. He said carefully, "Could you put him away?" Ron blinked. "He's not going to do anything. He's very old. He mostly just sits." "I know." Harry hesitated. "He makes me feel strange. It's not... I can't explain it." Ron looked at Harry, then at the rat, then back at Harry with the expression of someone conducting a rapid reassessment. Then he put Scabbers back in his pocket without arguing. "All right," he said. "Old things are like that sometimes." The prickling behind Harry's scar faded. He agreed that yes, old things were probably like that sometimes, and said nothing more about it. Molly fed him without making it into something he had to be grateful for, which was the most extraordinary thing about it. At the Dursleys there had been rules about food, how much, when, whether the day had gone well enough to earn a full plate. Harry was 6 years old, and the rules were the oldest thing he knew. He sat at Molly's kitchen table and ate quickly, the way he had always eaten, his hands moving before the rest of him remembered it was different here. Molly watched him eat on the second morning. She said nothing. She did not count the pieces of toast. When his plate was empty, she put more on it, without asking if he wanted more, in the way you'd fill a glass that had run low, matter-of-factly, as if the keeping of him fed were simply something that happened here, like the ghoul turning over in the attic, or the gnomes coming back to the garden, no matter how many times you threw them over the hedge. On the third morning, the toast was already on his plate when he sat down. Harry picked up the first piece and understood, all at once, that she was going to keep doing this. He ate very carefully, like something he was not yet sure he was allowed to keep. Fred and George decided the new boy needed a proper introduction to the garden. "The gnomes," Fred said, presenting this information with the tone of a tour guide, "have been here longer than any of us." "Longer than the house, possibly," George agreed. "They bite," Fred said, "but if you spin them fast enough first, they get confused and don't bother." Harry looked at the garden. In the daylight, it was even more chaotic than it had appeared from the window, overgrown at the edges, full of plants he couldn't name, and occupied in varying states of concealment by several potato-shaped creatures who were watching the three of them with the focused attention of individuals who had formed a tactical opinion. "Right," Harry said. "You just grab them round the ankles," George said, demonstrating on the nearest gnome, which immediately sank its teeth into his wrist with what appeared to be genuine conviction. George spun it twice over his head, smooth and practiced, and released it toward the hedge. It arced over with a fading, indignant noise, and disappeared. Harry reached down and picked up the gnome in front of him. It bit his thumb. He threw it, more out of reflex than any technique, and it went considerably farther than George's had, tumbling end over the hedge and landing somewhere in the field beyond with a distant, heavy thump. Fred and George looked at each other. "Do it again," Fred said. Harry laughed. Not the small, contained kind of laugh he had permitted himself at the Dursleys, the kind you allowed when it was safe and let no one hear. The actual thing, from somewhere deep and involuntary, helpless with it. Fred and George lit up the way people lit up when they had found something unexpectedly good. It was the first time in longer than Harry could remember that laughing had felt like something he was allowed to do. That night, Harry dreamed about a green light. He always had the same dream when his scar was bad, less a story than a feeling, cold and enormous and foreign, pressing at the back of his skull from somewhere distant. He woke suddenly, as he always woke, with his forehead damp and his heart going too fast. The glass of water on the nightstand was floating 6 inches above the wood. He had seen this happen before. Things moved when he was frightened, or his scar hurt. At the Dursleys, it had never been safe. He pressed his hands flat to the sheets and waited. The glass descended by itself and settled back on the nightstand without spilling a drop, as gently as if it had been set down by careful hands. Harry waited. The house was quiet around him. Ron breathed steadily in the other bed. Above them, the ghoul shifted once in the attic and was still. From below, the small sounds of a house at rest. No one came. Harry let out a breath. He lay back and pressed his hand over his scar, the way he always did when the dream had been close, and watched the ceiling until his heartbeat came back to something ordinary. The glass of water sat on the nightstand, like nothing had happened. He was 6 years old, and the house was still around him, and no one had come. He closed his eyes. He went back to sleep. Bill Weasley had been picturing the Burrow from Hogwarts since September, the particular smell of it, the way the kitchen was always doing 3 things at once, the predictable and beloved chaos of a family that took up more space than it technically had room for. He had not been picturing a dark-haired boy of about 6, sitting cross-legged on the living room floor with Ron, both of them tangled in what appeared to be a string of enchanted fairy lights that had achieved a degree of willfulness and were refusing to cooperate. He stopped in the doorway. The boy looked up. He had very green eyes, the specific, arresting green of new leaves, a color Bill had seen exactly once before, in a photograph at a memorial service when he was 12 years old. He had stood in a room full of people trying to hold themselves very carefully together, and looked at a photograph and thought, she had the most unusual eyes. He knew whose eyes those were. Harry Potter, sitting on his living room floor, helping Ron untangle lights. "You must be Bill," Harry said, with the direct pragmatism of a child who had learned that adults expected acknowledgement first. "Ron said you were coming." "That's right," Bill said. He crossed the room and sat down, and did not say any of the other things occurring to him at significant speed. "Are you winning?" He nodded at the lights. "No," Ron said. "They keep adding knots." "They do that." Bill reached over and held the end of the string while Ron worked at the tangle. He did not look at the scar on Harry's forehead again, but he was aware of it the way you were aware of something bright at the edge of your vision. He had questions. They would wait until his father came home. He found Arthur in the garden after supper, standing at the far end near the hedge, with the specific stillness of a man who had been thinking for a while and had arrived somewhere difficult. "Dad," Bill said. Arthur turned around. The expression on his face was the one Bill associated with his most settled decisions, the compressed, careful look of someone who had thought something completely through and was not going to be undone by scrutiny. "I was going to write," Arthur said, when the term ended. "I know." Bill stood with him in the cold air. The gnomes had been driven underground for the evening. The garden was briefly peaceful. "Who knows? Your mother. Now you." Arthur's hands were in his coat pockets. "Bill, I found that child in a cupboard under the stairs, with a thin blanket and a broken toy car and nothing else." He said it evenly, the facts allowed to carry their own weight. 6 years old in a cupboard under the stairs. I could not walk away from that. Bill did not say, "You should have taken him to Dumbledore." He said carefully, "Does Dumbledore know where he is?" "Not yet." The cold sat between them for a moment. "Your mother decided," Arthur added, which was not a complaint. It was an acknowledgement of a fact of nature that had been settled before Bill arrived and was not available for renegotiation. "He's a quiet boy. Good-natured. Careful." He looked at Bill with something in his face that was very close to asking for something, though Arthur Weasley was not a man who asked easily. He needed a place to land. "I know," Bill said. He did. He was 16, and he was not certain his parents had thought this all the way through, and he was also quite certain, standing in the cold garden, looking at his father's face, that he was not going to say so. Christmas dinner was loud and warm, and involved 4 simultaneous conversations across a table that had been extended 3 times already, and still felt too small, which was, as far as Bill could remember, how Christmas dinner had always been. He watched Harry in the spaces between everything else. The boy ate carefully now, not the frantic speed that his mother had described from the first days, but something more considered, a deliberate slowing down that read like a child who had figured out the food was not going to disappear and was letting himself believe it. He passed dishes without being asked. He listened to Percy's detailed explanation of some point of Hogwarts history, with the patient attention of someone who had learned young that listening cost you nothing and occasionally paid dividends. He made Ron laugh twice without appearing to be trying. And the scar. When the candles caught it at the right angle, Bill watched it. He had taken Defense Against the Dark Arts for 4 years, and studied harder than most of his year, and he could not name what he was seeing. Not a hex. Not a curse signature he recognized. Not any enchantment he had come across in 5 years of magic. Something that sat behind the scar rather than on it. Old and dense, and very slightly wrong, the way a note sounds wrong in an otherwise correct piece of music. Something that did not belong to the face it was on. He took a long drink and engaged Percy on the subject of OWL study strategies, because Percy was extremely easy to engage on that subject, and it gave Bill something to do with the part of himself that was still watching. Across the table, Charlie was explaining something about gnome trajectories to Ron with both hands, and Harry was laughing at him, and the candles burned steadily, and the scar was quiet. Charlie had no complicated relationship with any of it. "Underarm first," he told Harry the next afternoon, in the garden in the cold. "So the spin starts before you let go. Watch." He demonstrated. The gnome went over the hedge in a clean arc, protesting audibly as it went. "Your turn." Harry picked up the nearest gnome. It bit him. He threw it with the concentrated force of someone channeling something into a task. It went considerably farther than Charlie's. "Good arm," Charlie said, without qualification, the simple approval of someone for whom the result was the whole of the matter. "More spin next time, and it'll go farther. The spin is the important part." They spent most of the afternoon at it. Bill watched from the kitchen window for a while, mug in hand. Charlie was 14 and had not yet acquired the habit of seeing through things to what was underneath. He saw Harry as a small person who needed to learn the correct way to denome a garden, and he was teaching him with the patient thoroughness he brought to everything he cared about. Harry was concentrating with his whole face. It was exactly what the boy needed, Bill thought, and went to find somewhere else to be. He found Harry awake very late on Christmas night, sitting alone at the kitchen table with a mug between both hands, looking at nothing in particular. "Can't sleep?" Bill said. Harry looked up without surprise. "I wake up sometimes. At the old place I had to stay quiet. I wasn't sure if coming downstairs was all right here." "It's all right," Bill said. He put the kettle on. The house was still around them. Even the ghoul had settled for the night. "Do you do it often? Wake up?" "Sometimes my scar hurts," Harry said, in the tone of someone reporting a weather condition. "It doesn't last long." Bill brought 2 mugs to the table and sat down. They were quiet for a moment. "What do you do at Hogwarts?" Harry asked. "Study mostly. I've got my OWLs this year." "What does that mean you can do?" "Afterward. Determines what you can study next, what you'll be able to do with your magic eventually." Bill wrapped his hands around his mug. Why? Harry looked down at his hands. Can you fix things? With what you learn? Sometimes. What sort of things? Things that are wrong, Harry said, slowly and carefully, as if selecting the precise words. Not broken, exactly. Wrong in a way you can feel but can't explain. The kind of wrong that stays. He was not looking at Bill. He was looking at his hands on the mug, and Bill followed the line of his gaze and saw at the edge of Harry's palm an old pale scar that did not look like an accident. Sometimes, Bill said. It depends what it is. Harry looked up. He seemed to realize he had said more than he intended, and gave Bill a small, composed look that was entirely too old for a 6-year-old. Never mind, he said. Sorry. Thank you for the tea. He went upstairs. Bill sat at the kitchen table for a long time in the quiet house, his mug going cold, and thought about all the things that could make a scar. The knock at the door was not quite a knock. It was more a gentle suggestion, the kind of sound that made Molly think of someone asking permission to exist in a space rather than demanding entry, which was not the usual quality of knocking in this household. She had her hands in bread dough and went to see. The man at her door was very tall and very old. He had long silver hair past his shoulders and a beard to match, half-moon spectacles on a nose that had been broken at least once, and robes of a deep purple that should have looked outlandish and somehow did not. He looked for just a moment at the garden gnomes. Then he smiled over his spectacles. Mrs. Weasley, he said, I believe I have some business in your home. I wonder if I might come in. You're Albus Dumbledore, Molly said. I am. She stepped aside. You'd better come in, she said, which was not quite the same as welcome, and she thought he probably knew the difference. She sent the children upstairs. Fred and George went with minor protest, Ron with curiosity barely contained, Percy with the self-important gravity of a 10-year-old who understood he was being excluded from something significant. Ginny went wherever Ron went. She did not send Harry. Harry stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at Dumbledore, and Dumbledore looked at Harry with something that was not surprise. Older than that, more private, a recognition that belonged to a different conversation entirely. Molly said, Harry, please sit on the stairs. And Harry went without being told twice, because that was his way. She put the kettle on. She sat across from Dumbledore and folded her hands and asked, without preamble, What were you doing putting that child in a cupboard under the stairs? He did not pretend he did not understand the question. I did not put him in a cupboard, he said, precisely. I placed him with his relatives. The conditions within that household were not something I arranged directly. A pause that carried more weight than most people's sentences. Though I should perhaps have inquired more carefully. You should perhaps have inquired at all, Molly said. He did not disagree. How do you know about the cupboard, Mrs. Weasley? I know the condition Harry arrived in, she said. The rest is arithmetic. He looked at her, over his spectacles for a moment, reassessing. Then he folded his hands on the table and explained about the charm. A blood charm, cast when Harry was brought as an infant to his aunt's house. As long as Harry called that house his home, he carried a protection against Voldemort that could not be replicated anywhere else. The charm was anchored in Lily Potter's blood, which ran in her sister Petunia. The Weasleys, he said, with precision and without additional weight, had none of that blood in them. They could not extend that protection, regardless of how much they cared for the boy. The charm has already lapsed, he said. When Harry stopped calling that house his home, it began to fail. By now it will have dissolved entirely. Molly looked at the table. The bread dough was still waiting on the counter. Through the window, the garden was cold and grey and perfectly still, and she let the silence sit for a moment before she said, "What you are telling me is that the protection you built on the back of a child being kept in a cupboard is now gone." Dumbledore looked at her over his spectacles for a long, still moment. "Yes," he said. "That is, more or less, what I am telling you." "And the boy who was kept in that cupboard is now here," Molly said, "where there is no blood protection, and Voldemort is not dead." "That is correct." "I see," Molly said. She poured the tea. Arthur came home at noon, because Molly had sent an owl, and Arthur Weasley, when his wife sent an owl that said, "Come home now," always came. He walked in still in his work robes. He looked at Dumbledore. Dumbledore looked at him. Whatever passed between them in that moment communicated itself completely without words. "Professor," Arthur said, "habit, not deference." He sat down at Molly's side, their shoulders touching. "I imagine you know why you're here." "I have worked it out, yes." "Then I'll say now, I am not going to apologize for keeping him." "I am not here to ask for an apology, Mr. Weasley." "Good." Arthur's voice was quiet, which was when it was most certain. "Then let's hear what you have to say." What he had to say was this: Harry was in significant danger if his location became known. Voldemort had not been destroyed in 1981, only diminished. There were people who would want to know where Harry was, and people who would use that knowledge. The bond of blood had been the primary protection. It was gone now. He did not tell them about the prophecy. He did not tell them about what his investigations had begun to suggest was embedded in Harry's scar. He had, Molly thought, the quality of a man carrying considerably more than he was choosing to offer. Not deceitful exactly, but someone for whom the selective management of truth had become so structural over so long a life that he perhaps no longer fully noticed the shape of what he was withholding. She noted this the way she noted things she intended to come back to. She said nothing now. What he was telling them was already considerable enough for one morning. Arthur asked, "And in return for our cooperation, what do we receive?" Dumbledore said, "In return, I will not pursue the matter, and I will be available when you need me, which you may find you do." "Your proposal," Arthur said. "I would propose," Dumbledore said, "that we consider returning Harry to his relatives, or an alternative arrangement I can help to secure, somewhere with stronger protections." "No," Molly said. She said it the way she said the things that were not open for discussion, quietly, without anger or drama, the composure of a woman who had already made this decision before this conversation began and was not going to unmake it. "Mrs. Weasley, I understand your attachment." "He is not going back there," Molly said. Her voice had no heat in it, which made it considerably more final than heat would have. "He is not going anywhere. We are 7 children and a house held together by magic and not enough money, and Harry is staying here." Dumbledore looked at her. Then he looked at Arthur. "No," Arthur said. Dumbledore was quiet. He was a very old man who had been reading rooms for considerably longer than either of them had been alive, and this room had made its decision. He looked at his hands on the table. "Very well," he said. His conditions were 3. Harry's location must not be made known. To anyone outside this household, to anyone who asked, under any circumstances. If pressed, they had not seen him. The second, they mustn't tell Harry more about his parents than they had already told him. The time for that would come, but not yet, and not in pieces. The third, If anything about Harry's scar caused him pain, or if anything about his magic or behavior changed suddenly, they were to send for Dumbledore directly. Not the Ministry. Dumbledore. "And you'll stay away otherwise," Arthur said. "I will not intrude unless I am needed," Dumbledore said. He stood. He retrieved his cloak from the hook by the door and paused there. "Mrs. Weasley," he said, without turning, "you were right about the cupboard. I should have known." Molly set her cup down with a small, precise sound. "You should have," she said. He left. The kitchen was colder after he had gone, not in temperature, but in the way a space felt when something very large had passed through it and left its impression on the air. Harry was not on the stairs when Molly looked up. He had been there for most of the conversation. She had heard him shift his weight, once, the small, careful sound of him. But he had gone back up, and the stairs were empty. He had been sitting in the dark at the first landing, pressed against the wall the way small children pressed when they needed to be invisible. He had heard the word danger. He had heard his parents mentioned. He had heard a name said with a weight he had never heard put into a word before, a name that had the quality of something important and terrible and not yet his to understand. He had not heard enough to understand. He had heard enough to know the shape of what he was not being told. He lay in his bed and looked at the ceiling until his heartbeat came back to something ordinary. He pressed his hand over his scar. It was quiet tonight. He was 6 years old. He had always known, the way children knew things before they had words for them, that he was different in a way that had nothing to do with his hair or his glasses or the things that moved when he was frightened. He had been waiting his whole short life to understand what that was. He was not in a hurry. He was, for the first time he could remember, somewhere he did not have to leave. He could wait. The headmaster's office in the early morning had a quality Snape found he had never been able to entirely dismiss. Something about the light through the high windows, the portraits watching with their painted patience, the particular silence of a room that had absorbed too many significant conversations to pretend at neutrality. He stood before Dumbledore's desk and kept his face arranged into its working expression and waited to hear what he was being asked to do. The assignment, as Dumbledore described it, was straightforward. Ottery St. Catchpole, the Weasley family's home. He was to observe Harry Potter's situation, not to intervene, not to announce himself, unless unavoidable, to determine whether the child appeared safe and in reasonable health, whether the magical irregularities Dumbledore had been monitoring were visible from proximity, and whether the Weasleys could be trusted with what they were holding. Snape said, "You have not told them what they are holding." "Not in full," Dumbledore agreed, "and you want me to assess whether they should be." "Among other things." Snape looked at him for a moment. Dumbledore looked back with the expression that made it impossible to determine whether he was asking something or informing you of something you had not yet understood. "Very well," Snape said. He did not ask what the other things were. He put on his traveling cloak and left. His feelings about the assignment were not simple. He did not examine them. Ottery St. Catchpole, on a mild spring afternoon, had the quality of all small Muggle villages, a deliberate slowness, everything arranged to suggest that nothing significant ever happened here. He apparated to the edge of the village and walked through a lane between hedgerows until he found the Weasley house by the sound of it, a full-throated chaos of overlapping voices and something that was either laughter or argument, and possibly both. He did not approach the door. He found a gate at the edge of the garden, perhaps 50 yards from the house, and sat on it and observed. He was a thin, pale man in black robes with lank dark hair, and he sat with perfect stillness, and the afternoon went about its business around him. There were 2 boys in the garden. One was a redhead, clearly a Weasley by the colouring. The other was dark-haired and slight, and he was in the act of picking up a garden gnome and throwing it with great concentration over the hedge. The gnome arced over and was gone. The dark-haired boy watched it go, apparently satisfied. Then he looked up. He looked directly at the gate. Snape stayed very still. The boy had Lily Evans's eyes, not eyes that reminded him of hers, not a similar colour, not a similar expression, her eyes. The specific green, the particular quality of light in them, the look of someone paying complete attention to whatever they were looking at. Across 50 yards of spring garden, the boy looked at Snape with the eyes Snape had been carrying in his memory since 1981, and for one moment, the orderly professional distance he had built for the journey failed him entirely. The boy looked back at the hedge, apparently deciding the gnome was sufficiently dealt with, and went to find another one. Snape breathed out. He had known this would happen. Intellectually, he had known. It was in every account. Knowing had not helped. He noted this, and noted his own irritation at being surprised, and filed both in the place he kept things he could not afford in the field, and looked back at the garden. The scar was visible from here. He could feel it before he could see it clearly. A weight at the edge of perception, the particular texture of magic that had gone wrong in some fundamental way. He had spent years in proximity to the dark arts, first as a practitioner and then as a teacher, and he knew the feel of dark magic before analysis intervened, the way a musician knew a bad note in the bones before the mind caught up. This was not simply a scar. Whatever had happened on the night the killing curse rebounded, the result was not merely a wound. There was something in it. Something that pressed against the ordinary magic of the child, the way a lodged stone pressed into wood, dense, cold at its centre, and not passive. Not a dormant mark. Something living, in the loosest sense that the word could be applied to a thing that should not exist. He did not have the language for it precisely. He had studied dark magic extensively enough to know it was neither a curse nor an enchantment in any conventional configuration. It was as if something had become resident, as if the night in Godric's Hollow had not merely marked the boy, but had left something behind in the marking. In the face above the scar, Lily's eyes caught the spring light. Snape looked at the hedge. He put that particular thought where he put everything else, and looked back, professional, and continued to observe. Molly Weasley came out of the back of the house with a basket of laundry and saw him in under 3 seconds. She had, he noted immediately, the quality of a woman who noticed things. She looked at him on the gate, assessing, and then walked toward him with the direct purpose of someone who had decided that a pale man in black robes sitting on her garden gate without explanation was a matter requiring address. "Can I help you?" she said, polite but not particularly warm. "No," Snape said. "I was passing." It was not a convincing lie, and he had not particularly tried to make it one. Molly Weasley gave him the look of someone who knew a poor liar and had decided not to press it, for reasons she was keeping to herself. "You're Severus Snape," she said. "My son Bill writes about you. The potions master." "Yes," she said, in the tone of someone filing information. He looked briefly at the far end of the garden, where the 2 boys were working their way along the hedge. The dark-haired one was getting closer. Snape slid off the gate and straightened his cloak. "Good afternoon," he said. "Good afternoon," Molly Weasley said, in the tone of someone noting a detail and knowing exactly where to put it. He left before Harry reached the gate. His report to Dumbledore was technically competent and entirely controlled. The child appeared safe, he said. Well fed, integrating into the household without visible distress. The Weasleys were warm and chaotic and clearly attached to him. He had observed no sign of mistreatment, neglect, or instability. The irregularity in the scar was present, active, and complex in ways that suggested more than a single enchantment. It was not a simple dark mark. The innermost layer was not passive. It had the quality of something resident rather than applied. He could not characterize it further without a proximity he had not been instructed to seek. Dumbledore listened with his hands folded on the desk and his face arranged into that particular expression that meant everything and disclosed nothing. "Do you believe," he asked, "that the Weasleys should be given more information about what they are holding?" "No," Snape said. He said it a fraction too quickly. Dumbledore said nothing. He looked at Snape over his half-moon spectacles, and the portraits watched from their frames, and the office was entirely still. "Thank you, Severus," Dumbledore said. "That will be all." His office in the dungeons was cold and quiet in the ways he had always preferred. He sat at his desk with a glass of water he did not drink and thought about green eyes that had looked at him without recognition. There was nothing remarkable about that. The child was 6 years old. He had no memory of the war, no reason to know Snape's name, no context in which a pale man sitting on a gate in spring was anything other than a stranger in unusual clothes. He had looked, and not recognized, and gone back to the gnomes. This was the correct outcome. This was what Snape would have chosen if the question had been put to him. He had not wanted to be recognized. He had not wanted Lily's son to look at him with those eyes and see anything at all. He had not wanted to find out that Lily's son was apparently happy. That was new information. It was not information he had requested, and it was not information he found comfortable, and he held it with a care disproportionate to its content, the way you held something unexpectedly fragile, and he sat in the cold and quiet for a long time. He did not think about much else. 3 years is a long time to be 6 years old, and then not be. Harry did not have the language for it at the time, for the specific quality of those years at the Burrow, the way the days accumulated into a history that was his, and not borrowed, and not survived, just lived. He would understand it later. At the time, he simply lived it, the autumn and winter and spring and summer repeating, the house always full, his body getting taller in increments that surprised him when he caught himself in a mirror. It was the first time he had had a history to accumulate. The broom was Fred's, left propped against the garden shed for a week, while Fred made up his mind whether to fly it or take it apart for other purposes. Harry had not meant to do anything with it. He had been walking past in the garden, 7 years old and in no particular hurry, when his hand brushed the handle, and the broom lifted 3 feet off the ground before he could let go. He had hung there, feet above the grass, gripping the wood with both hands, looking at the garden below him with an expression he would not have been able to describe. Not fear, something more like very alert surprise. And then the accidental magic subsided, and the broom came down as gently as if it had been placed. Ron had seen the whole thing from the kitchen window. He did not tell anyone except Ginny, and Ginny's understanding of the situation was that Harry had done something excellent, which was not an unreasonable interpretation. Harry did not correct her. September 1987. Percy packed for Hogwarts. The train came into platform 9 3/4 on a clear morning, with a sound like something fundamental arriving, and Harry stood on the platform with Ron and Ginny, and watched the scarlet engine produce its steam, and thought, In 4 years, that will be Ron and me." Percy shook hands with his father and accepted a long hug from his mother with the resigned dignity of an 11-year-old who understood that this was the cost of being cared for. He had labelled all his potions' ingredients, arranged his trunk alphabetically, and written his name on the inside cover of every book. The other students boarding around him probably had not. When the train pulled away, Ron said, "It'll be brilliant when it's our turn." Harry looked at the platform, at the smoke dispersing in the morning air. "Yeah," he said. "I think it will." He believed Ron. He had found that believing Ron about most things was a reasonable policy. Molly sat with him at the kitchen table on Tuesday afternoons that first year and taught him to read properly. The Dursleys had sent him to school in the sense that they had sent him to the building. What he had actually learned there was the amount you learned when the real purpose of sending you somewhere was to have you out of the house. He was behind for his age. He was not behind for very long. Molly was patient in the way she was patient with everything, entirely, without drawing attention to the patience, as if it were simply the natural condition of sitting at a table with a child and a book. She corrected him without commentary. She gave him books with pictures first, then books with fewer pictures, then books with none. And when he reached the last page of one, she put the next one in his hands, as if the continuation were obvious, as if there were no question of him not continuing. He read everything he could find after that. He was hungry for it in the way he had been hungry for food when he first arrived, catching up on something long owed. He still could not explain his dislike of Ron's rat. He had tried once or twice to put it into words, and the words never arrived in a useful configuration. The rat was old and missing a toe, and had black eyes that caught the light at angles Harry could not make himself comfortable with, and that was the best he could do. Ron had accepted this the way he accepted most of Harry's peculiarities, with the equanimity of someone who had grown up in a house too full for anyone's oddities to receive sustained attention. One night in the autumn of 1988, when Harry was 8, their bedroom gone cold from a heating charm that had run out, Harry woke from a dream about green light. The scar on his forehead had its familiar distant pulse. Not pain exactly, more a pressure, like something very far away, becoming briefly aware of him and then subsiding. He opened his eyes in the dark. Scabbers was watching him from across the room. Not asleep. Not moving. The small black eyes fixed on Harry's scar with a quality of attention that was not, in Harry's experience, the attention of a rat looking at something. Harry pulled the blanket up over his forehead. He did not tell Ron. He was not sure what he would say. Bill wrote to him separately from the family letters. It had started in Bill's 6th year, without explanation. The family parchment would arrive, and inside it would be a smaller folded square addressed to Harry in Bill's handwriting. The contents were never personal, exactly. A fact, an observation, something Bill had been studying. One letter said, "Hogwarts has 7 floors above ground, plus dungeons that go down considerably further, and towers and grounds that include a lake, a forest, a Quidditch pitch, and staircases that move. The staircases are not a design flaw. They are considered a feature." Harry had read this letter 3 times and spent the rest of the day thinking about what kind of building had staircases that moved, and why anyone would build it that way, and whether you could get used to it, or whether it surprised you every time. Another letter, later in the year, said, "Old objects in the wizarding world sometimes have enchantments layered inside them the way rock has layers of sediment. You'd need a trained eye to count them all, and most people don't bother to look." Harry kept that one. He kept it in the 3rd drawer of the nightstand, where he kept things that mattered, and he did not take it out often, and he did not examine why he felt the need to keep it. The head boy letter arrived the summer of 1988, which meant Bill would carry the title for his final year, the 1988-89 school year, his 7th. Arthur read the letter at breakfast, passed it to Molly without a word, and then sat very still for a moment before his eyes filled, and he had to remove his spectacles to clean them, which he did for considerably longer than the spectacles required. Bill always was going to be head boy, Ron told Harry, in the tone of someone explaining an obvious fact about the weather. Did he know that? Harry asked. I think Bill sort of knows things like that about himself, Ron said. He took another piece of toast. It's a Bill thing. Ginny, who was 7 and had strong opinions on almost everything, said, "What's a head boy?" Harry explained it with confidence and significant inaccuracy. He described it as the boy who was in charge of all the other boys, which was not entirely wrong as a summary of the role. Ginny considered this and found it reasonable. They were both satisfied with the explanation and moved on to other topics. The summer of 1989. Harry was 9 years old. He was lean and healthy, with dark, untidy hair and green eyes, and a scar on his forehead that the people of the Burrow looked at the same way they looked at any other part of him, which is to say they looked at him and not at it, which remained, 3 years in, the most ordinary miracle he had been given. It was the summer Bill graduated. The family went to the ceremony, a warm June evening at Hogwarts, Arthur wiping his eyes behind his spectacles at the precise moment he had predicted he would not, Molly in her best robes with her hands clasped, Ginny sitting between Harry and Ron and asking quiet questions that Harry answered with increasing accuracy as the ceremony went on. Afterward, Harry found Bill standing at the edge of the grounds, looking at the castle going gold in the evening light. "What happens now?" Harry asked. "Gringotts," Bill said. "Training for a year or so. Learning the professional side of things. And then Egypt? Eventually. When they've decided I know enough to be useful." He glanced over. "Why? Will you miss me?" Harry considered this with the seriousness he brought to most things. "We'll still get letters," he said. "You'll still get letters," Bill said, and something in his voice settled into something slightly different, something that was not quite a promise but was the shape that promises took. Different kind of letter, though. Harry looked up at the castle. The evening light was doing something extraordinary to the towers. He did not say, "I think there's something in my scar, and I think you might be the one who can eventually tell me what." He did not say it because he was 9, and because some things you carried carefully and waited for the right moment to set down. He was good at carrying things carefully. He had been practicing for years. The fireplace went green, and then Bill came through it. Ron had been expecting him for weeks, making confident predictions about the arrival date based on nothing more substantial than the conviction that Bill would obviously come home as soon as he could. He was pleased to note he had been right. He had been less accurate about what Bill would look like. Bill was 19 years old, and he had been in Egypt for the better part of a year, and both of those facts had done something to his appearance that Ron had not fully accounted for. He was taller than Ron remembered, or seemed it, broader in the shoulders, and there was something in the way he held himself that suggested a man who had spent months in places where being certain of your footing was not optional. His hair was long and tied back. There was dust in the seams of his travelling robes that had the quality of dust from somewhere far away, and he had a fang earring, which Ron took in with a moment of honest surprise before deciding it suited him. "That's new," Ron said, pointing at the ear. "It is," Bill agreed. The next several minutes were occupied by their mother, who welcomed Bill in the way she welcomed all of them home, thoroughly, at some volume with both arms. Arthur shook his hand, and then gripped his shoulder and did the thing with his spectacles that he always did when something moved him and he was trying not to show it. Fred and George attempted to tell him 3 separate things simultaneously and succeeded in conveying none of them. When the first wave had passed, Ron found Harry standing at the edge of the kitchen and said, "Bill, this is Harry." Bill looked at Harry with the particular expression he had worn on every visit home for the past 4 years. "I know who he is, Ron." "I meant as my brother," Ron said. Harry looked at both of them. He appeared to be working out what to do with this, which took a visible moment, during which his ears went slightly pink. Then he said, "Hello," to Bill, in the tone of someone who had decided to accept things gracefully. "Hello," Bill said. "Still keeping my brother out of trouble?" "Mostly," Harry said, which was, Bill thought, honest. Supper was the particular chaos of a full table with a story to tell, and Bill told it well. The tombs, the work, the way the Egyptian heat settled into the rock of the chambers and made the stones warm to the touch even underground, the way the ancient curse layers had left their signatures in the walls like initials in old woodwork, each practitioner distinct, each century distinguishable from the last by the quality and character of what they had laid down. Centuries of enchantments stacked in the walls, protective and dangerous, layered over and under each other, requiring the kind of reading that you had to learn to do slowly and carefully, and without assumptions. "You can feel where one layer ends and the next begins," Bill said, "like rings in cut wood, once you know how to look." Harry, who had been eating with more focus than he usually brought to soup, said, "Can you always tell the difference between dark magic and protective magic when they're layered together?" Bill looked at him. "Almost always," he said. "They have different textures. Protective magic feels warm, active, like something still working, still doing the job it was made for. Dark magic is colder, denser. Once you've felt both, you don't mistake one for the other." Harry nodded, in the slow way that meant he was filing something. Bill made a mental note that Harry had asked the question and did not pursue it, and went back to the story about the tomb on the 4th level that had turned 3 of the senior curse-breakers' hair entirely blue for a fortnight. After supper, the family settled in the sitting room in the comfortable aftermath of a full meal. Fred and George had challenged each other to something that had resulted in Ron's exploding snap cards doing something they were not designed to do. Ginny was asleep in the armchair with her mouth open. Molly was knitting. Arthur had fallen asleep behind which broomstick. Harry was laughing. Bill watched him from across the room and said nothing. The firelight was good tonight, warm and direct, and it caught the scar on Harry's forehead at exactly the angle that Bill had spent months learning to call diagnostic. In Egypt, reading enchantments on ancient objects, you watched the way light fell on enchanted surfaces, the way they had a quality of depth that unenchanted surfaces did not, a presence that revealed itself in the right light if you had trained yourself to look. He had trained himself to look, 3 distinct layers around the scar, not placed on it, around it, the way sediment formed around a lodged stone, each layer acknowledging what was there before it had been laid down. 2 of the 3 were old and warm-feeling in the way he associated with protective magic, not identical to each other, but of the same fundamental character. Complex. The work of someone skilled, something that wanted to keep doing what it had been made to do. The 3rd was not like that. It was dark in the specific way the curses in the deepest tombs were dark, not only dangerous, but wrong in some more fundamental sense. Wrong the way a thing was wrong when it violated the nature of what it was supposed to be. Not dark magic laid over the boy from the outside, dark magic that was in the scar itself, as if it had arrived from inside rather than been applied, and had settled there like something that had found where it belonged. Harry laughed again at something Fred had done. His scar caught the firelight, and Bill looked at it, and looked away. He drank his tea. He kept his face where he had learned to keep his face when he found something in a tomb that he was not yet ready to name aloud. Hagrid arrived the following afternoon with a paper bag of rock cakes. He was an extraordinary presence in the Weasley garden, enormous, over 11 feet tall, broad enough to make the garden gate look like something scaled for a different species, with wild black hair and a beard of comparable wild blackness and small, bright, beetle-black eyes that were, in Bill's observation, considerably more attentive than their owners usually let on. He said he had heard through channels he didn't specify that Harry was here, and had wanted to come and see how he was getting on. He shook hands with Arthur, an operation that required Arthur to use both of his, and accepted tea, and sat in the garden and talked about gnomes and muggle garden implements with Arthur for considerably longer than the subject warranted. He ate one of his own rock cakes, which appeared to require effort. He expressed polite interest in the state of the hedges. He was, throughout all of this, extremely careful not to look directly at Harry's scar. Bill noticed this from the shed doorway, where he had gone to retrieve nothing in particular. It was not the careful not looking of a person trying not to stare at something unusual. It was the deliberate, practiced not looking of someone who already knew what was there, and had decided, a long time before today, that they were not going to look at it if they could help it. Not because it wasn't significant. Because it was. When Hagrid finally said his goodbyes, to Molly, to Arthur, briefly and with some care to Harry, a large, careful hand on Harry's shoulder, and an expression that contained considerably more than it displayed, and disapparated with a crack that startled the gnomes, Bill stayed in the shed doorway for a moment. Then he went inside. He sat at the kitchen table after midnight, alone. On the table, a piece of parchment and a small instrument from his Gringotts kit, a diagnostic tool designed for reading layered enchantments on ancient objects with minimal interference. He had adapted it in the field, with some success, for surfaces that were not strictly objects. He was reasonably confident the adaptation would hold. He sat and looked at them. Then he put them away. He sat at the table for another 10 minutes. He thought about what he owed Harry, who had come to his house at the age of 6, and asked him, at midnight on a Christmas night 4 years ago, whether you could fix things that were wrong in a way you felt but couldn't explain. He thought about what he owed his family, who were asleep above him, and who had been protecting Harry for 4 years without the full picture of what they were protecting. He thought about Hagrid's careful, deliberate not looking. He got up. He took the parchment and the diagnostic tool back out of his bag. He went to his parents' bedroom and knocked quietly. Arthur answered in under a minute. He had always been a light sleeper, which was the quality of a man who had always had reasons to stay alert. "Bill?" Arthur said. "What's the matter?" "Nothing is the matter yet," Bill said. "But there's something I need to ask your permission to do." They asked him at breakfast. Actually, they had been trying to ask him all morning. Harry could tell by the way Molly had been unusually quiet over the toast, by the way Arthur kept looking at Bill and then at Harry, and then at his eggs, as if they required particular attention. He was 9 years old and had been living with this family for 4 years, and he had become quite good at reading the particular quality of a silence that had something specific waiting inside it. When Ron and Fred and George and Ginny had been sent out to the garden, herded outside with a brightness that was slightly too determined to be natural. And when Harry was left at the kitchen table with Arthur and Bill and Molly, standing in the doorway with her hands clasped, He sat very still and waited. Bill said, "Harry, I want to ask you something. You don't have to agree." Harry said, "Is it about my scar?" A pause. "Yes." "All right," Harry said. "What do you want to do?" Bill explained. He had a tool from his work, a method for reading enchantments on objects, layered enchantments, the kind that sat inside things rather than on them. He had reason to believe there were enchantments like that in Harry's scar, and he wanted, with Harry's permission and Arthur's, to try to understand what they were. Harry looked at his hands on the table. "I always knew there was something there," he said. Not distressed, stating a fact he had been carrying for as long as he could remember, the way you stated a fact that had always been true. I could feel it. I didn't know what it was. He looked up at Bill. "All right," he said, "if you want to look." He had been waiting 4 years for someone to ask. They sat at the kitchen table together, Bill and Harry, in the quiet of a summer morning, with the other children outside, and gnomes distantly aggrieved in the garden. Molly stood in the doorway. She did not watch, exactly. She kept her back partly to them, as if she could be present without being in the way of it, and her hands were very still. Arthur sat beside Harry. He had not been asked to, but no one suggested he shouldn't. Bill set the diagnostic tool on the table, unremarkable to look at, but precise in the way of things made by a very old professional tradition. "You might feel something," he told Harry. "It shouldn't hurt. If it does, say so, and I'll stop." "All right," Harry said. "And if you want me to stop for any reason, I'll tell you," Harry said. Bill began. The outermost layer was the first thing his tool found. In his first year as a curse breaker, Bill had worked through tombs thousands of years old, reading enchantments laid down by practitioners long dead, and he had come to know the range of what ancient magic felt like. Ancient could mean many things. This was none of the kinds he had encountered in the tombs. This was ancient and warm. The quality of it was unlike anything he had encountered in the field, not because it was stronger or more complex, though it was both, but because of its character. Protective magic tended to feel like something still working, still maintaining the purpose it had been given. This felt like something more specific than that, like the working itself had been made from something personal, something the caster had put in at genuine cost. He could feel the intention in it the way you felt the intention of a craftsman in old goblin metalwork. Not performed care, but actual care, sunk into the making, permanent in it. A mother's sacrifice crystallized into magic, embedded in his blood, intact. Bill breathed out. He looked at Harry, who was sitting with his hands flat on the table and his face composed. "That one is not the problem," Bill said, quietly. Harry looked at him and did not ask what it was. The second layer was immediately below the first, and he found it almost at once. Where the outer enchantment had been whole, this one was broken, not destroyed, the architecture of it intact, the intention readable, but the edges raw and the break recent in the scale of these things. A seal that had been whole and had come undone when the condition it required was no longer met. He recognized the work. He had learned something of what Dumbledore had done in 1981, from Arthur, from the visit 3 years ago, from everything the family had pieced together. A blood charm of extraordinary precision, the specific kind that tied a protection to a place, and a blood relative that required a particular living condition to remain active. The caster's signature was in it the way all skilled casters left their signatures in their work, a quality as recognizable as handwriting once you knew what to look for. Bill set down the tool. He looked at Arthur. There was a blood protection on him, he said, tied to a specific place and a blood relative. It's been broken for 4 years, since he came here. Arthur said, I know. Dumbledore cast this. Arthur looked at him. He said nothing. That was its own answer. Bill picked the tool back up. The third layer. He found the edge of it and stopped it. In his first year of tomb work, he had encountered dark magic in configurations he had not previously imagined. Curses designed to kill with thoroughness. Curses designed to trap, to drain, to possess, to leave a person alive in a condition in which being alive was the cruelty. He had worked through them professionally. He had been frightened, sometimes. He had kept working. This was not like any of those. This was a fragment of something alive. Not a curse. Not an enchantment in any conventional configuration. A piece of something else. A piece of another consciousness, cold and dormant, but not inert, waiting in the scar the way a seed waited in soil that had not yet been warm enough to wake it. Not placed on Harry. Not designed for Harry. Something that had arrived the way a splinter arrived in skin, incidentally, in the course of something else tearing open, embedding itself in the wound. Not Harry's. Had never been Harry's. Something that did not belong here, and was here regardless, and had been here for 9 years. Bill set the tool down. His hands were steady. He had been trained in the keeping of hands, steady in the presence of things that had no business existing. He set the tool on the table and did not pick it up again. Harry's scar had been burning for the past several minutes. Not badly, or the familiar pulse, the distant cold pressure he had known his whole life, always there in the background. It had intensified while Bill was working, enough to be noticeable, enough to draw his attention to it, even as he was trying to keep his face still. He looked at Bill. Bill's face was arranged into a controlled expression that confirmed everything Harry had already known. I always thought there was something wrong with it, Harry said. Not wrong because of the scar. Wrong in the scar. Like something was in it that wasn't mine. Like something was living in it that shouldn't be. Bill looked at him for a long moment. Harry, he said, with great care. There are some things I need to talk to Arthur about. Do you think you could go and find Ron? Harry pushed back from the table. He stood. He looked at Arthur, who looked back at him with the expression he wore when something was very serious, and he was choosing not to show how serious it was. Harry picked up his glass of water from the table. He did not run. Bill sat at the kitchen table after Harry had gone. The tool was in front of him. He did not look at it. Arthur sat across the table. Molly had come in from the doorway and stood with her back to the counter, arms folded, waiting. 3 enchantments, Bill said. The first is ancient, older than anything I've found in the field. Protective magic, embedded in his blood, not in his location, not tied to any place. A sacrifice, made permanent. He paused. It's intact. It's not going anywhere. Arthur nodded once. The second is Dumbledore's work, a blood charm, very specific kind, tied to a living blood relative. It lapsed when Harry came here, and the condition for it wasn't met anymore. That protection is gone. Arthur was still. Molly's hands had gone tight on her own arms. The third is not a protection. It is not a curse placed on him. It was not designed for him or aimed at him. It wasn't deliberately put there at all. Bill looked at Arthur directly. It's a fragment of something alive. Something that was not his when it arrived in that scar, and is still not his. Something that does not belong to Harry in any sense. It has been sitting there for 9 years, and no one outside this room, No one in this family, or so was told. The kitchen was very quiet. "I think," Bill said, "this is why Dumbledore hid him. I think Dumbledore has known since the beginning that this was there, and chose not to tell us." Arthur sat with this for a long time. Then he said, "We need to talk to Dumbledore." Arthur told her slowly. He had always been this way with difficult things, methodical, proceeding in the order events had occurred, rather than in the order of their weight, because he knew that if he started with the weight, he would not finish. Molly sat across the kitchen table from him, and Bill sat at the corner between them, and the clock ticked on the mantel, and the house was quiet in the way it was only when all the children were genuinely asleep. He began with the scan itself. 3 enchantments, he said. The first one he described the way you described something good. Lily's sacrifice, ancient magic, embedded in Harry's blood. Not tied to any place or any living arrangement. Just there, in him, warm and intact. Bill said it was the oldest thing he had encountered in a year, working with Egyptian stonework. He said it was warm the way things were warm when love had been put permanently into them. Molly set her cup down. The second enchantment, Arthur said, was a blood charm. Dumbledore had placed it. It had broken when Harry came to them. She already knew the outline of this from 1987, from the conversation at this same table. But hearing Bill confirm the mechanism, the shape of a seal whose edges were still raw from the breaking 4 years later, made it specific in a way the earlier conversation had not. A thing that had been whole and then had come undone when its condition was no longer met. She said, "And the third?" He said, "It is something alive. Not a curse placed on him, not something designed for him. Something that was in the scar when it formed on 31st October 1981, and has been there for 9 years, and is not Harry's. A fragment of a consciousness, cold, Bill had said, aware, waiting in the same way that a thing waits when it has somewhere to go. He said, "It is the worst thing Bill has encountered in his first year of working with dark magic." Molly held the mug in both hands. She did not cry. She had been a mother long enough to know that crying had its time, and this was not it. Right now she needed to understand all of it, to hold all of it clearly, and she would cry later when the children were nowhere near her face. She breathed out. She looked at Arthur. She said, "Whose fragment?" Arthur was quiet for a moment, not deciding whether to tell her, deciding how to say it in a way that was honest and did not break him to say. Then he said, "We don't know the word for what it is, but we know where the scar came from." The scar had formed on the night of 31st October 1981. They all knew this. The date was not obscure. The boy who lived, the killing curse that had rebounded from a 15-month-old child. What no one had told them, what Harry had been carrying for 9 years without any of them knowing, was that something had not dissipated in the rebound. Bill said, "Whatever it is, it's alive in the sense that it has intent. It was there before I even reached it. It's waiting for something." The kitchen was very quiet. Molly looked at Arthur. Arthur looked at the table. Neither of them said it, and then Arthur said, "You know who?" Not a question. A statement of what they already believed before any of them had spoken it aloud. They had no proof of the precise mechanism. They had a curse-breaker's professional assessment of a 9-year-old child's scar, a date, and the arithmetic of everything Dumbledore had and hadn't said in the kitchen 3 years ago. Bill had spent a year reading the signatures of dead practitioners in Egyptian stonework, and he said the fragment in Harry's scar was not like a dead thing. It was not faded. It was waiting. Bill said nothing, which was its own answer. Arthur had already sent the owl. Remus Lupin arrived at the Burrow in the early hours of the following morning. He came on foot from the apparition point at the edge of the lane, and Molly heard his footsteps on the path before he reached the door and opened it before he could knock. He was 30 years old and looked older than that in the way that he always did. The hair prematurely grey-streaked at the temples and through the brown, the robes carefully patched at the cuffs and elbows, the face of someone who carried something chronic and had arranged himself around the carrying of it long ago. The exhaustion in him was not circumstantial. It was structural. He looked at Molly in the doorway and said, "Arthur's message said it was urgent." She stepped back. "Let him in." He sat across from Bill at the kitchen table, and Arthur told him the same way he had told Molly, in order, methodically, beginning with the ancient warmth of the outermost layer and ending with the thing that did not belong in Harry's scar. Lupin listened without speaking. When Arthur finished, Lupin sat with his hands on the table for a long moment. Then he sat back. He breathed out in a way that had a great deal in it. He said, "I see." He could not name what was in the scar. He was the last free marauder, and he had spent most of his adult life closer to dark magic than he would have chosen, and he did not have the knowledge for naming it precisely. But he knew something about souls. He said, "When a killing curse rebounds, nothing in recorded history suggests what should happen then. But consider this." He paused. He was reasoning aloud, and he wanted the reasoning to be precise. He said, "Dark magic of that magnitude, cast by a soul already damaged from years of killing, from whatever he had done to himself to make himself harder to destroy. A soul like that is not stable. A stable soul, fractured, would dissipate, would simply vanish." He looked at Arthur. He said, "What you're describing is the behavior of a soul that fractured, and a piece of it found somewhere to go." Arthur said, "Harry." Lupin said, "The scar." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "I don't know the word for what it produces. I'm not sure many people would. But I am reasoning from what I know about unstable souls and what happens to them under catastrophic pressure, and I'm arriving at the same place Bill arrived." Bill said, "Dumbledore knows." Lupin said, "Yes." He looked at nothing for a moment. He said, "I think Dumbledore has known from the beginning. He said it the way you would say something that had long since settled into fact. They were agreed before they said it. The shape of the decision had been in the room since Arthur finished. They needed to go to Dumbledore, and this time they were not asking about whether to keep Harry, and they were not listening to carefully measured information. Bill had a diagnostic record. Lupin had standing. The last of James and Lily's closest friends, who was free, who had not been imprisoned or had faked a death and vanished. They had evidence, and they had a name, you know who, and they needed someone to confirm it and tell them what came next. Arthur said, "Bill comes. He has the professional record." He looked at Lupin. "If you're willing." Lupin said, "I am." Arthur looked at Molly. She said, "I'll stay." She said it with the composure of someone who had made this decision before it was asked of her. Plainly, without resentment, the way she said the things that were not open for discussion. She was good at holding things in place while the people around her moved. 7 children asleep upstairs and Harry among them, and someone needed to hold the house. She said, "You come back and you tell me everything." Arthur said, "Yes." Harry had been awake for 20 minutes. He did not know this precisely. He had no clock in the room, and Ron was deeply asleep in the way Ron slept, without apparent concern for the state of anything. But he had woken from something, and the house below him had a specific quality. Not dangerous, careful. the low voices of adults who did not want to be overheard. He knew this quality well. He had been learning to read adult tones of voice for as long as he could remember, and he was good at it. He lay in the dark and did not go downstairs. He thought about Bill's face at the kitchen table 2 days ago, the expression before it was composed, the thing that had been in his eyes for just a moment before he controlled it. He thought about Bill saying his name. "Harry, there are some things I need to talk to Arthur about." The small slip, the correction. He pressed his hand to his scar. It was quiet tonight. The familiar pulse, the distant, cold pressure that had been with him his whole life, like a sound he had stopped hearing until the room was very still. He thought about the look on Bill's face. He was 9 years old. He had been patient because patience was one of the first things you learned when you were small and needed to be good and still, when the alternative was something he did not want to think about now. He had learned patience very young, and he was good at it. He could wait a little longer. He turned toward the wall. Ron's breathing was steady beside him. After a while, the voices downstairs faded, or his attention did. And he slept. The castle appeared through the trees in autumn dark, lit from within by 1,000 windows, and older than anything Bill had learned to see in Egypt. He had walked these grounds for 7 years as a student. He had known the stone underfoot in every season, the smell of the lake in November, the sound the staircases made at night. Coming back from outside, not as a returning student, but as a man who had spent a year in professional proximity to very old and very complicated magic, it looked different. The same and different. He was aware of layers in the stonework, the way he was now professionally trained to be aware of layers. The enchantments on the building went beyond anything he had encountered in Egypt, beyond what a single practitioner could have placed, a thing built over centuries by people who had understood what they were making. He had a piece of parchment in his coat, his diagnostic record of Harry's scar. His hands were steady. His stomach was not. Lupin walked beside Arthur. No one spoke. McGonagall met them at the entrance and said nothing beyond their names, a brief acknowledgement, and led them through the castle to the headmaster's office without elaboration. Bill had been in this office 3 times as a student, once in 3rd year, twice as head boy. He remembered the portraits of former headmasters on the walls, the particular settled calm of the room, the desk positioned so that whoever sat behind it had the quality of having always been there. Dumbledore looked up when they came in. He was very old, the long silver hair past his shoulders, the beard to match, the half-moon spectacles on a nose that had been broken at least once, the richly coloured robes. He had the quality of a man who had, in a very long life, anticipated a great many arrivals, and he recognized the character of this one before any of them had spoken. He studied them for the space of 2 heartbeats. He said, "Please sit down." He said, "Can I offer you tea?" Arthur placed Bill's parchment on the desk. He sat, but he put the record down first. He said, "We know about the 3 layers of enchantment in Harry Potter's scar. We want to know what the 3rd one is." Dumbledore looked at the parchment. He looked at Arthur. He folded his hands. He said, "I see." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Very well. Let us begin at the beginning." He began with the bond of blood. He explained it as he had explained it to Molly in 1987, and then he explained it more fully. The mechanism, the condition, the duration. Petunia Evans as Lily Potter's closest blood relative. The charm he had placed when Harry was brought to Privet Drive, a few hours after the events of 31st October 1981. The condition, Harry must call that house his home until he came of age at 17. the protection it afforded against Voldemort for as long as that condition held. And then the condition had not held. Harry had come to the Weasleys. The charm had lapsed within weeks. Lupin said, quietly, without anger, in the even tone of a man who had thought through the implications before he spoke, "You placed that child with those people on purpose, knowing what it would be like for him." Dumbledore's expression did not change. He said, "Yes." Lupin looked at the desk. He said nothing more. The silence he left was specific. The silence of a man who had decided that what he was thinking was not a thing he would say aloud. At least not yet. Arthur said, "The blood protection is gone now. We know this. It lapsed when Harry came to us." "What is the third enchantment?" Dumbledore said, "Before I answer that, there is something you should know about why Harry occupies the position he does." He said it with the composure of a man who had been carrying a sentence for 9 years and was now preparing to give it to people who were not ready to receive it. He told them the prophecy, not the full text, the key line. He spoke it precisely, without inflection, and either must die at the hand of the other, for neither can live while the other survives. He said, "It was delivered to me in early 1980 before Harry was born. It names Harry Potter and Lord Voldemort. It was the reason Voldemort came to Godric's Hollow on 31st October 1981. He came because of this line, because of what it meant for his own survival if he ignored it." Arthur went very still. Bill looked at his own handwriting on the parchment in front of Dumbledore, protective, severed, dark. He was the youngest person in this room. He was also the one who had sat across the kitchen table from a 9-year-old child and watched him accept the examination with the patience of someone who had been waiting a very long time for someone to acknowledge the thing he felt but could not name. He said nothing. He waited. Dumbledore looked at the diagnostic record for a long moment. He said, "The third layer is a fragment of Voldemort's soul." He said it with care, the care of someone who had been sitting with this sentence for 9 years without being able to give it to the people in this room who should have had it long before now. He said, "When the killing curse rebounded on 31st October 1981, Voldemort's soul, already damaged, already made unstable through years of choices I will not fully detail tonight, shattered. A fragment of it embedded itself in the wound it had opened in Harry's forehead, in the scar." He said, "This has connected them in ways I am still learning to understand in their full complexity, and it is something that will, in the end, need to be addressed." Bill said, "Addressed how?" Dumbledore said, "The path forward is not yet fully clear to me." He said it with the steadiness of a man accustomed to giving technically true answers. Bill looked at him. He said nothing. He was holding something back, and he knew he was holding it. Lupin spoke. He said, without flinching from the words, "If a fragment of Voldemort is in Harry, does Harry need to die for it to be removed?" Dumbledore did not answer immediately. He was a very old man, and he was looking at the last of the people who had loved the boy, whose son now carried his most closely kept secret, and something behind the composure of his face was not entirely composed. He said, "That is a question I am still working on." Lupin said, "That is not an answer." Dumbledore said, "No, it is not." Bill stood up. He was 19 years old, the youngest person in the room by decades, and he had spent a year in Egypt and come home and applied every professional skill he had acquired to the scar of a child who had sat at a kitchen table with his hands flat on the wood and said, with the patience of someone who had been waiting his whole life for someone to ask, "I thought so. All right." He said, "Professor Dumbledore." He said it quietly. He said, "You placed that child in a house where he was kept in a cupboard under the stairs. You placed enchantments on him, more than one, layered, none of them simple, without telling anyone who loved him what was inside him. You sent him there, knowing what that house was, and knowing what was in his scar, and you have managed the information about both of those things with great care for 9 years, and no particular concern for whether the people keeping him alive deserved to understand what they were holding. And you are telling us now, when we have come here with a professional record, and you have been caught, that you are still working on whether he needs to die." He said, "He is 10 years old." Dumbledore looked at him and did not look away. Something showed in his face that he did not usually permit. Not self-justification, not the patient composure of a man explaining a difficult decision. Something older and quieter than either of those. He said, "You are right to be angry." He said, "I have been managing this from the position of someone who believed he could see far enough ahead to justify the decisions he was making." He said, "I carried the prophecy alone for 9 years, because I believed that certain information, given too soon, would cause more harm than its absence." He paused. He said, "I may have been wrong about some of those decisions." It was not an apology. It was what an apology looked like in the mouth of a man who had not often needed to make one. Arthur said, "We are not returning Harry to you." Dumbledore said, "I know. I am not asking you to." He looked at Arthur, then at Lupin, then at Bill. He said, "What you have given him, these 4 years, this family, is not nothing. I want you to know that I understand that now, even if I didn't fully understand it when you refused me the first time." Arthur stood. Lupin stood. Bill picked up the diagnostic record from the desk and put it back in his coat. He looked at Dumbledore once more. Dumbledore looked back at him with the expression of a man who was reconsidering something he had believed settled and finding that it was not. Bill said nothing more. He followed Arthur and Lupin out of the office. The portraits of former headmasters watched them go. Arthur came through the door first. Molly was in the kitchen when she heard them, the sound of the gate, then footsteps on the path, then Arthur's hand on the latch. She had known this sound for 20 years. She knew the quality of how he moved when he was tired, and when he was afraid, and when he was both. She set down the cloth she was holding. They came in. Arthur first, then Bill, then Lupin. She read all 3 of them in the space of 3 seconds, the way she read a room she had lived in for 20 years. Arthur's face had the expression he wore when he was holding something too large for one person and was managing it by increments. Bill looked like he had been angry and had not finished being angry. Lupin looked like a man who had just been given confirmation of something he had suspected for a long time and found no comfort in being right. She sent the children upstairs. She filled the kettle. She waited. They told her in order. Arthur led. Bill provided the professional detail. Lupin said the things that required the kind of witness he was, the last of James and Lily's people, the one who could give human weight to what was otherwise a problem. 3 enchantments. The first, Lily's sacrifice, ancient and warm and intact. The second, Dumbledore's blood charm, severed when Harry came to them. The third, a fragment of Voldemort's soul in the scar, cold, alive, waiting. Then the prophecy. Arthur said the line quietly, without inflection, and either must die at the hand of the other, for neither can live while the other survives. The fire was low. The clock ticked. Molly held the mug in both hands and did not speak until they had finished. Then she said, "We are not telling him." Bill said, "He has a right to know." Molly said, "He is 10 years old." She said it the way she said things that were decided. She said, "He is 10 years old and he is happy. I do not know if you understand what that means. He was not happy before he came here. Not once, as far as I can make out, was that boy given something uncomplicated and good just because he existed and deserved it. He has had 4 years of it here." She looked at Bill. She said, "We are not taking that from him tonight." Bill looked at the table. He was not wrong. She was not wrong. There was no room in the kitchen for both those things, and they sat with them anyway, in the silence. Arthur said nothing. He reached across and covered Molly's hand with his, and she turned hers and held it. And that was that. Lupin stayed. He was in the spare room, or did not sleep by the quality of him when he came out. And late in the night, when Arthur had gone to bed and the house was quiet, he and Bill sat on the front step in the cold. The autumn was well into itself. The sky was clear. Bill said, "You think we should tell him?" Lupin said, "I think James and Lily would want him to know." He said it without hesitation. Then he said, "I also think James and Lily are not here, and Molly and Arthur are. So," a pause. He said, "I have been the last of James's friends for 9 years. Sirius is in Azkaban, Pettigrew is dead, or everyone believes he is, and I am the last one. I spent 9 years not knowing what I owed Harry. Every time I tried to work it out on my own, I arrived somewhere I couldn't trust." He said, "I did not choose this very well." Bill said, "How do you carry it?" Lupin looked at the dark fields. He said, "You learn not to, mostly. You just hold it." Bill said nothing. He understood this better than he might have a year ago. Before Egypt, before the tombs, before the scar. He held his mug and looked at the sky, and thought about Harry asleep upstairs, and the thing in the scar asleep with him, and what it meant to hold something you could not put down, and had not yet been told how to use. He thought about what Lupin had said, "You just hold it," and understood, slowly, that holding was not the same as carrying. You could carry something and be crushed by the weight of it. Holding was something else. Holding was deliberate. It was the choice you made every morning to acknowledge the weight and keep going, to not let it become the whole of you. Lupin had been doing it for 9 years. Bill had been doing it for a season. He did not think it got easier. He thought it got more familiar, which was a different thing entirely. An hour before they came home, Harry had been laughing. He and Ron were at the kitchen table, with what had been left for them, bread and soup, and something Ginny had taken the last of before either of them could reach it. Fred and George had done something that afternoon involving a garden gnome and an old hat, the details of which became increasingly improbable as Fred and George narrated them from the sitting-room doorway. Harry had his elbows on the table in the way Molly had reminded him not to, and he was laughing with his whole face, the way he laughed when something was genuinely funny, and he was not thinking about anything except the thing in front of him. His eyes were bright. Green, his mother's green, the particular shade that caught light differently from anything else in the room. His hair was dark and untidy in the way it always was. He was 10 years old and he was slight, and he had a scar on his forehead that no one in this household looked at except as a part of him. He passed Ron the bread without being asked. Ron said something, and Harry said something back, and they were both laughing again. Just 2 10-year-olds at a kitchen table with soup going cold, and nothing else required of them. This was what Molly was protecting, not his ignorance. She knew it was not a permanent protection, knew the prophecy was fixed, and not hers to unmake. She was protecting this moment, this evening, this boy with elbows on the table, and his whole face open to whatever came next. In the morning, Molly made breakfast. Harry came downstairs. He sat at the table and looked at Molly, then at Arthur, then at Bill, who was eating toast with more focus than the toast warranted, then at Lupin, sitting quietly with his hands around his cup. Harry said, "Did something happen?" He had always been this way. Since he was 6 years old, he had read rooms with the instinct of someone who had needed advance warning and learned not to expect it. Molly had never been fully able to outwit it. She had stopped trying. She said, "We talked to Dumbledore." Harry waited. She said, "Everything is all right." He looked at her for a long moment. He was 10 years old, and in 4 years she had never lied to him about the important things. She had said, "I don't know, and I can't tell you yet." But she had not lied. He looked at her face with the careful attention he had always brought to faces, the habit of reading what people were not saying. Then he said, "Okay." He took a piece of toast. He ate his breakfast. The decision not to tell him yet was not a comfortable one. It was the right one for this morning. Whether it would remain right was a question none of them answered, and the kitchen was quiet and ordinary, and Harry ate his toast, and Molly made more tea, and outside the garden was grey and cold, and the gnomes had gone underground for the season. It was an ordinary morning. That was its own kind of protection, she thought. As long as mornings were ordinary, as long as toast was toast and tea was tea, and Harry sat at this table with elbows where she'd told him not to put them, there was still something intact. She could not keep the prophecy from being true. She could not keep what was in his scar from being what it was. But she could keep this morning ordinary for one more morning, and then the next one, and the one after that, until the time came when she could not. She would decide what to tell him when it came. Today it had not come yet. That evening, Lupin made his goodbyes. He shook Arthur's hand in the kitchen. He held Molly's hands for a moment before letting go. He found Bill on the landing and said something quiet that Bill nodded to. He found Harry and Ron at the bottom of the stairs and put a hand briefly on Harry's head, lightly, carefully, in the manner of someone who had been waiting years to do it and was not sure it was his to do. And Harry looked surprised but did not pull away. He collected his cloak from the hook by the door. He was crossing the sitting room when he stopped. Scabbers was on the arm of the chair nearest the fire. Old, missing a toe, apparently asleep in the way the rat always slept, with the quality of something not fully asleep, if you looked at it carefully. Lupin stood very still and looked at the rat for a long time. His expression did not change. Whatever he was thinking did not reach his face. He picked up his cloak. He left without saying anything further. But he did not walk away from the Burrow with the look of a man who was at peace with everything he was leaving behind. Dumbledore came on a cold afternoon in late autumn, unannounced, the way he always did. Bill answered the door. He had been the one closest to it. He had been in the kitchen reading, and he heard the knock before anyone else did, and he went to see. When he opened the door and found Albus Dumbledore on the step, he was not surprised. He had been expecting something like this since they left Hogwarts in September, some version of a follow-up, some next move from the oldest chess player any of them had ever encountered. They looked at each other for a moment. The old man who had been managing Harry's situation for 9 years, and the young man who had come home from Egypt to find the most complex enchantment he had ever seen in a 10-year-old child's scar. There was a recognition in it, not warmth, but the acknowledgement of two people who had been professionally useful to each other's understanding of the same problem. Dumbledore said, "I would like to speak with everyone, not only Arthur. Everyone who is in the house." Bill looked at him for a moment. Then he stepped aside. The sitting room in late afternoon was cramped with the Weasley household, and one very old wizard who had chosen, notably, not to sit. Arthur and Molly on the sofa, Bill standing near the window, Fred and George on the floor with the studied casualness of two 12-year-olds pretending not to be paying very close attention. Ginny on the arm of the chair, Ron beside Harry on the second sofa, close in the way he sat when he was uncertain. Harry sat with his hands in his lap and looked at Dumbledore steadily. Dumbledore said, "I have come to propose an arrangement," he said. "I would like Harry to come and live somewhere with stronger magical protections, somewhere he can begin to prepare for what is coming." He said it to the room, to Arthur, to Molly, to Bill. He did not look at Harry when he said it. Harry said, "With respect, sir, I live here." He said it quietly, without drama. Not defiance, a statement of fact, delivered with the composure of a 10-year-old who had been carrying the weight of something he did not yet fully understand and had decided, somewhere along the way, that he was not going to let it move him from where he stood. Dumbledore looked at him. He said nothing immediately. He was a very old man, and he had looked at this boy across great distances, had read reports, received assessments, made calculations, and now he was looking at him directly, across a sitting room full of Weasleys, and the boy had Lily Potter's eyes, and James Potter's hair, and the patience of someone who had been waiting for years without losing his footing. Molly stood up. She said, "Professor Dumbledore." She said it the way she said things that were not going to be argued with, quietly, without heat, with the composure of someone who had made her decision before the conversation began. She said, "My children go where they choose to go, and so does Harry." She said, "You have done a great many things for a great many reasons, and I understand that most of them were in service of something larger than any of us can fully see." She said, "You hid him from the world, and you hid the world from him, and you chose a cupboard under a staircase because it had the right kind of blood in the walls." She stopped for a moment. Then she said, "That was not enough for him. You know it was not enough for him. He is standing here now, and you can look at him and see for yourself what 4 years of something better looks like." She said, "He stays here." Dumbledore looked at her for a long time. The portraits in his office, a few weeks ago, had watched Bill with the same quality of attention, patient, thorough, recording. He had something of that quality now. He was not looking for a weakness in her argument. He was simply looking. He said, "I know." He said, "I came to ask, not to compel." He said, "I want to be clear that I understand the difference, and that I will honor it." He said, "The bond of blood was broken when Harry came to you, and there is nothing I can do to restore it. It was specific to Petunia Evans, and specific to that house, and it is gone. But the sacrificial protection remains." He said it carefully, as if he wanted it to land precisely. "It is not tied to any location or any blood relative. It travels with him. Wherever Harry is, Lily's sacrifice is in him, and that protection is intact." He looked at Harry. He said, "What this family has given you is not nothing. I want you to know that I understand that now, even if my understanding of it came later than it should have. Even if I had to be confronted with the evidence before I accepted what it was worth. It was not quite an apology. It was what Dumbledore's apologies looked like, and Molly had decided, somewhere in the last several weeks, that it was the most they would get, and that she would accept it. He made his goodbyes. Brief, considered, the goodbyes of a man who understood he was not warmly welcome and was not going to make the occasion longer than necessary. He paused at the door. Bill was closest. Dumbledore said to Bill alone and quietly, "You have an exceptional talent for seeing what is hidden in old things. It will serve you for the rest of your career." He said, "I would ask you to keep what you found between the people in this house for now." Bill said, "And in exchange?" Dumbledore said, "In exchange, I will tell you, when the time comes, what the third layer means and what it will require. All of it. Not the careful version. All of it." Bill said, "When the time comes had better not be when it's too late." Dumbledore said, "No, it will not be." He went out into the cold afternoon. The door closed behind him. Bill stood at the window and watched the long silver hair disappear down the path, and did not move until the garden gate swung shut. Ron found Harry on the front step. He sat down next to him without asking whether he wanted company, because that was not something Ron asked. He simply sat. They looked at the garden together. The frost had come early this year, the gnomes had gone underground 3 weeks ago, and the garden had the quiet of a place whose usual noise had temporarily relocated. Ron said, "You okay?" Harry said, "Yes." Ron said, "Do you know what he was talking about?" Harry said, "Some of it." Ron said, "And?" Harry thought about this for a moment. He thought about the scan, and Bill's face, and the low voices he had heard in the kitchen at night. He thought about the look on Lupin's face when he had put a hand on Harry's head and not been sure it was his to do. He thought about Dumbledore looking at him in the sitting room, across the full weight of everything neither of them had said. He said, "I'm still here, aren't I?" Ron said, "Yeah." Harry said, "Then it's fine for now." Ron leaned back on his hands. After a moment, he said something about Fred and George, and whether the garden gnomes would retaliate when the ground thawed, and Harry said something back, and they were 2 10-year-olds on a cold step talking about gnomes, and the afternoon went about its business around them. That night, the Burrow in winter, the garden gone quiet under frost, the gnomes underground and grumbling about it, the ghoul in the attic settled into whatever the ghoul did when the weather turned. A clock ticked on the mantel. The fire was banked low. The house breathed the particular way old houses breathed when everyone in them was finally asleep. Harry Potter, aged 10, was asleep in a bed that was his. Ron's breathing was steady beside him. The lightning bolt scar was quiet on his forehead. The faint, cold pressure that had been with Harry his whole life, present and familiar, the way a sound is familiar when you have stopped consciously hearing it. Somewhere in Albania, a wraith thing that had once been a man moved through the dark between one diminished existence and the next. What remained of its soul was distributed across 5 objects hidden in the corners of a world it had mostly left behind. A diary, a ring, a locket, a cup, a diadem. And it was not strong enough yet to act, and not weak enough yet to stop waiting. And one fragment of it was asleep in the Weasleys' spare bedroom. Warm, dreaming behind the eyes of a boy who did not know yet what he was carrying, who did not know yet what would eventually be asked of him, who knew only that something was there, and had decided, with the patience of someone who had learned very young, that some things had to be waited for, that he could hold it. For now. He was good at holding. He would learn. He had always been going to learn. There was a prophecy, and there was a scar, and there was a wraith in Albania that would not stay diminished forever. But not tonight. Tonight he was 10 years old, and the house smelled like someone had cooked for him on purpose, the way it smelled every night in this house, and it was winter and cold outside and warm inside, and Harry Potter was home.